Well, it's been a long time coming, but I have just finished reading The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien, the first part of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Now, this is an incredibly important book for me. It sort of started it all, reading my interest in literature and history, my appreciation of aesthetics, my understanding of masculinity, my interest in genealogy and arts and culture and so many different things I think I can trace back to the Lord of the Rings. And of course, not just the books, but the movies as well. I don't think there are very few, if any, things in my life that have been more formative and more influential than the Lord of the Rings. So I don't really have any records, but I believe this is probably one of the first books that I ever read. It would have been the summer of 2003, I believe, where I went and watched The Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers, the Peter Jackson films. I think it's because we didn't own a DVD player at the time. So instead of borrowing them, I went and watched them. And then I think it must have been around Christmas time when The Return of the King came out and we went to theaters. Me and like my best friend and my cousins and my extended family, a whole bunch of us took up a whole row in the theater and went to see Return of the King, which for years and years afterwards, like I wasn't someone who went to the movies that often as a kid, but that experience of seeing The Return of the King for the first time as a 12-year-old, like I said, incredibly formative. So I believe I must have got these books, the whole trilogy, around that same time and read through them. Later I bought The Hobbit, read that, and then in 2005 I bought The Silmarillion and went heavy into that. And then I remember later in high school someone gave me as a gift the Unfinished Tales. So my whole sort of beginning, or it's a preteen really, but my whole teenage years were just absorbed in the culture of Tolkien. And I mean, it's been over 20 years, so it's so different now. But for people who are a bit younger and don't realize just how important those films specifically were coming out in the early 2000s, like they were huge, like Marvel, Harry Potter, Star Wars, what have you, that sort of level of huge. Everyone saw them, everyone knew them, and they were wonderful. Now, I know this is meant to be about the Fellowship of the Ring, but I just need to explain sort of how important these books are and this world is. I'm going to try not to strictly compare the differences between the film and the book, but I mean, I'm not going to be able to help it. I'm going to have to talk about the two as sort of one thing because they're so influential to me, especially the movies. I adore the films. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess I've always been a reader, but these books specifically are probably the first that set me on the course, especially for fantasy novels. So my sort of reading journey started with these books, and over the past 2 decades has gone sort of far and wide. And especially recently, I've sort of gotten away from fantasy and started reading more broadly, especially classics and literature more broadly. So I kind of feel this is coming full circle, coming back to the roots and going from reading fantasy to classics and literature to classical literature, fantasy, going back to where it all began with the Lord of the Rings. I think I've only read this once, so this is probably only my first reread. But like I said, it's been well over 20 years. There's a really important nostalgia that I personally feel when reading this book. And I'm going to get through the whole trilogy, and then I'm going to, of course, watch the films again, which are so impactful to me. I can't help but tear up at certain scenes in all 3 of them. So I said I'm not going to compare the book to the movie, but the book was written starting in the 1930s and the 1940s and then published in the early 50s or mid 50s. And it does sort of feel, I don't want to use the word dry. I don't want to criticize the book too much, but I want to really sort of, I guess, praise the films as being the perfect adaptation. They change things, yes, but they have so much emotionality to them and they put so much feeling and maybe it's just the music, Howard Shore's soundtrack, that, I mean, the whole time reading this, I'm hearing those tracks in my head as I'm going through these scenes. But there's just something about the films, and maybe it's just because it's more modern. Like, for example, in this book, we have, of course, the main character, Frodo Baggins, who is an upper-class, landowning, wealthy person. He doesn't really work for a living. He's got lots of money. He's literally a Nepo baby. He is the nephew of a super wealthy person, and he inherits all his wealth from him. And his manservant, his gardener, Sam Gamgee, is the one who goes on this quest with him and helps him out. And it's a very Edwardian, because of course Tolkien was an Edwardian character, very Edwardian relationship of the sort of the upper house and the lower house, or the upper floor and the lower floor, where we have the Frodo the master and Sam the servant. And the films, I think, make it much more palatable to a modern audience by making it, they still have that kind of dynamic where Sam is Frodo's gardener, but it makes it like they're best friends and they sort of grew up together, and that friendship they have, that intense love and self-sacrificing friendship of doing absolutely anything for the other. I think the films just do a fantastic job of representing, and I love and adore the films for that. Everyone should want to have a friend like Sam, not a servant like Sam. Okay, so I'm just criticizing the book, but the book itself is kind of amazing for what it does. It's because I'm just going to say things that people have been saying for the past 50, 70 years, but I know it's not this first fantasy novel, but so many things have branched out and copied and been influenced by it that the novelty of it kind of isn't there anymore. We have experienced, especially if you're a fan of the fantasy genre in various media, everything in this has been taken and ran with for miles and miles. Like every trope, every character type, everything has been expounded upon and used over and over and over again. That does not or should not diminish the importance of a work of fiction like this. So if you can sort of wrap your mind around the fact that yes, this was written in the 1930s and 40s, like that's so long ago, it can maybe help you appreciate it more. It's not bad though. It's not bad in any sense of the word. It's an amazing story. So the world itself is interesting in that it is very much a black and white world. There is good and there is evil. If you're an elf, you are good. If you are a hobbit, you are good. If you are an orc, you are evil. But of course, there are parts in this book where people who are evil can potentially be redeemed. So the character of Gollum, where they're all sort of disgusted and they pity this creature that has had this ring for centuries, and they're all like, oh, we should just kill him. But they're constantly staying their hand and thinking, well, we don't need to kill this thing. I mean, is it evil? It sort of is evil, but it's had sort of the source of its evil, this ring, removed from it, and so there's a chance at redemption and maybe it will heal. And then of course the other way around, there is the potential for corruption and turning to evil, specifically the character Boromir at the end of this book. Not just Boromir, but Frodo himself, a little bit to a degree in this book, and then his uncle Bilbo, who had the ring for decades previous. The ring itself is that corrupting influence that can take a good person and, against their will, make them evil. The ring is this sort of, it is power, it is raw power, and power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Yeah, so the world is very much divided into good and evil, but there is some crossover, but nowhere near like what you would see in a modern fantasy novel. If someone wrote something like this, everyone would, in the 2020s, everyone would think it's kind of bland. Like, what do you mean there's good and evil, and all the elves are just good and all the orcs are just evil? I want to see an orc perspective. What if there's an orc that doesn't want to fight for Sauron anymore? Like, I'm jumping all over the place, but I assume that maybe this is wrong of me, but I assume that everyone knows the story of Lord of the Rings. It starts out in the Shire, this sort of idyllic, I've never been to the UK, but it feels like sort of a English countryside with everyone happy and celebrating, and it's inhabited by these creatures, these hobbits, that they are not ambitious at all. They're not really even that greedy. I mean, they're not human, or are they human? They live very peaceful lives, and they love celebrating and giving gifts and eating and drinking, and they don't really like going on adventures or anything, big changes or anything. Tolkien himself had to have been a very conservative person, like small c conservative, literal conservative, in that he wants to conserve sort of a place and a time that doesn't really exist in the 20th century anymore, or certainly in the second half of the 20th century. He sort of idealizes this pre-industrial world, which is what the hobbits inhabit. And throughout the course of this book, there's sort of hints and rumors and sort of prophecies that the Shire is going to be corrupted. This perfect world is going to be ruined by evil. And how is that ruination embodied? Well, in one instance, it is the form of a factory, this massive brick factory spouting and spewing smoke, which I believe Tolkien, who grew up in town or a village outside of Birmingham, that Birmingham, as it expanded in the early 20th century, sort of began to encompass. And so he had his own Shire taken away from him by industrialization. And he very much idolizes nature. And again, so that's conservative nature, as in conservation, conserving nature. So the characters of the elves specifically, they sort of, I don't know if worship nature is the right phrase, but they hold nature in high regard, and they live in sort of tune with nature. And greens and golds and silvers are really important to them. Trees and leaves and forests and rivers and streams and ponds and pools and all that sort of thing. And so yes, so again, I'm getting off track, but we have these hobbits living in the Shire. One of them inherits a magical ring. Turns out this ring was created by this evil Dark Lord millennia ago to control all of the other peoples of Middle-earth who have themselves created rings. So it's one ring to rule them all. And through a series of coincidences and potentially not coincidences, the ring has ended up in the Shire to the most unlikely creature, a hobbit, and has been passed down to Frodo Baggins. And now the enemy, Sauron, is aware that the ring has been found, and so he is seeking it. And so this novel is Frodo, through the help of many different people, trying to get the ring and destroy it. And this is only the first part, but it is the start of his quest. So he, of course, teams up with 3 other hobbits, Merry, Pippin, and Sam, 2 of which are his friend, one of which is, again, his gardener. They flee the Shire. They're being chased by these black riders, which revealed are the owners of the 9 rings that were given to men. Now, men, of course, being a sort of a gender-neutral term in the world of Tolkien. Tolkien himself was a philologist. He would have understood that men is not male, it is human. We have woman and we have weremen. That would have been the gendered terms, the root being men. Anyways, I mean, we can talk sort of a bit about gender in Lord of the Rings. So I had some roommates a few years ago, and we would always joke that in Lord of the Rings there was only 6 female characters. There was, of course, Arwen, Éowyn, Galadriel, Rosie Cotton, Lobelia Sackville Baggins, and Shelob. And it does very much feel like that. Like, even in this one, we have Galadriel, Arwen, who makes a very small appearance, and Lobelia Sackville Baggins. So we have our sort of 3 female characters in this one. And it is even kind of strange that all of the other characters, all of the sort of main characters are all males. They're all single. None of them have any children, even though they're all, like, the youngest, I think, would be in their late 20s. I think Frodo is like 50. Frodo is 50 by the start of this, but hobbits will age differently. Aragorn's like in his 80s. But of course, he's a special kind of human that can live really long. So he's sort of has the vibe of someone in their late 30s or even early 40s, we'll say. At least in my head. Maybe if you read this maybe when I read this when I was 13, I pictured him as being like 25. I don't know. But it is very strange that there is sort of no women in this book at all. So again, let's get back on track. We got the hobbits. They got this ring. They gotta leave the Shire. So there's this wizard, Gandalf. He's told them, hey, I gotta go check on some things, but you gotta get out of the Shire. I'll meet you, or I'll come get you, or I'll meet you or something. Anyways, Gandalf never shows up. So they get a really close encounter with a Black Rider. Again and again, this happens. The Black Riders almost catch them. So they continue fleeing east. They exit the Shire, pass through the old forest where they meet this crazy guy, Tom Bombadil, who's really fun. And he even takes the ring and like puts it on at one point, and it has no effect on him whatsoever. He is a different sort of character. He's sort of like so ancient that he's been around since the world was young. Nothing in the world really affects him. He's just living his best life. They leave him. They go through these barrows where this Barrow Wight, this sort of ghost from an ancient battle that has been buried there, tries to capture all these hobbits, but Frodo, he's like made of sterner stuff, and he comes to and he calls Tom Bombadil to come help them, and they escape, and they eventually get to Bree, this sort of town on the I guess it's not in the Shire, but just outside the Shire, where there's hobbits, there's men, there's dwarves passing by, and in there they meet this man Strider, who they're like, is he one of the bad guys? He seems kind of like a ruffian. Who is this guy? But they find a message left by Gandalf saying, hey, trust this guy, Strider. He's actually Aragorn, son of Arathorn. Turns out he is the heir to the throne of men. He is sort of the last descendant of this long line of kings. And so with the help of Strider, they manage to flee and almost get to Rivendell. So Rivendell is their goal. It's the House of Elrond, this sort of elven lord where it's one of the last bastions of elves in this world. So elves and their magic are sort of bleeding away. And this is a point in history where the magic of the old world is beginning to pass away, and we're entering into a sort of a more modern world where magic and elves no longer exist. But Rivendell and Elrond are sort of one of the last bastions. They almost get there, but They are stopped on this hill, Weathertop, where 5 of the Black Riders catch up with them and stab Frodo in the shoulder, which causes him, of course, much pain. And Aragorn manages to fight them off with fire, and they continue on. A couple of weeks pass. Poor Frodo, he's like losing all feeling in his arm. He's starting to fade and become a shade or a white or a sort of a ghost, much like the ring wraiths, these 9 Black Riders. They come across an elf, Glorfindel, who has left from Elrond, and he's sort of looking for them because he knows that they're about. And they get to this ford where they got to cross over to the river into Elrond's lands. As they do, the 9 suddenly appear upon them, but the power of Elrond and the water surges forward and washes them away, seemingly destroying them, but not really. And Frodo awakens in the House of Elrond to Gandalf sitting beside his bedside. Tells him the whole story. Hey, you were healed. That's great. Now we got to have some meetings. So they have a whole bunch of meetings with various peoples because it turns out that sort of, again, from coincidence and because the world's getting darker and the Dark Lord is on the rise again, things are happening. People have come to the House of Elrond for wisdom and for advice and counsel. And so they have a big council, and this is when Gandalf reveals that, hey, you know, I'm one of the wise, one of the wizards. There's this other wizard, Radagast the Brown. I ran into him, and he told me that Saruman the White, who is the leader of the Order of Wizards, was looking for me. So I went and checked out Saruman. Turns out Saruman's now evil. He's no longer Saruman the White, because all these wizards have different colors. There's Radagast the Brown, Gandalf the Grey, Saruman the White. Saruman's now calling himself Saruman of all colors, and he's got this sort of Technicolor dream coat on, and he has been sort of corrupted by this power. He's not in league with Sauron, certainly. He wants to sort of surmount and surpass Sauron. He says something like, a new order is rising. I want you, Gandalf, to be by my side, and we can sort of rule as one. And sort of, it's a very Nazi ideology, and you can imagine if this is being written in the 30s and the 40s, Tolkien could not have helped but seen what was going on in Germany and this sort of new order and this new thing, fascism, and what is that? It seems like that's what Sauron's really into. Of course, Gandalf's like, no, that's evil. I know what's good and evil in this world, and you are clearly now on the evil side. I'm not going to go there. So Saruman locks him up on the top of the Tower of Orthanc, where Saruman like hangs out. But luckily, when Gandalf ran into Radagast the Brown, he said, hey, Radagast, like, tell all your woodland friends, because Radagast's like, he doesn't really hang out with the sentient races that much. He's much more into nature and animals and stuff. He said, tell all the animals to spread the word that, you know, stuff is happening, the evil is rising, and to be on the lookout. So fortunately, there was a great eagle, and we're talking great, these things are huge, that's flying around, and it sees Gandalf up on top of the tower, and it's like, Gandalf, what's going on? And he's like, hey, I'm stuck here, Saruman trapped me, can you give me a lift? Sure. And so the eagle flies Gandalf away, and Gandalf escapes, eventually makes it back to Rivendell with the elves. They debate what they're going to do and really get into, like, what can we do with the ring? Can we throw it into the sea? Can we find a dragon to destroy it? Can we throw it into a volcano? And they realize that the only way to destroy it is by throwing it into Mount Doom, this volcano where in Mordor, where Sauron had created it. But of course, that's on the other side of the world in the very heart of evil. So they're like, well, can we hide it somewhere? And they really don't. They're like, that's just kicking the can down the road. We need to deal with it now, or it's going to just crop up again. And no one really knows what to do. And then, of course, Frodo stands up and he said, I will take the ring to Mordor, though I do not know the way. And they're really grateful for him. And then they sort of sleep on it. And then Elrond says, like, okay, we're going to have 9 people go with you. We're going to have sort of people representing all the different races of the world. Now, of course, the word race is used here, and I think even in fantasy today, we use the term race is the term used a lot, when maybe a word like species would be, or even species is a weird one, but of course, because this is written in the 30s and 40s, the word race is the word that they use. That's just the word. Of course, we don't use that word now, and if a book like this had been written now, they would use a different word. But all the races of the world are going to join together to create this Fellowship of the Ring in order to help Frodo get to Mount Doom, or at least go as far as they can. They're not sworn by any oath that they have to continue on this journey. They just are going to do what they can. So we have a dwarf, we have an elf, we have 2 men, and we have 4 hobbits and Gandalf. So that makes 9, I think. But it is really interesting that if you do think of this as a book written in a very racist time in Europe, that it's a very multicultural book. It's a very accepting book. One of the huge themes of this book is the sort of racial prejudice that the elves have for the dwarves and the dwarves have for the elves, and they really can't stand each other. But through the course of this book, even just this one first book, we see the dwarf Gimli and the elf Legolas becoming like best bros. Like they will stand up for each other, they will fight for each other, they will do whatever they can for each other, just through the course of what happens to them in this book. And again, it's such a multicultural, and it's showing that while people have their differences can be a strength, and having all of these different people with all these different viewpoints and skills and whatnot together is an amazing thing, and that's what gives the Fellowship its strength. And I think that's really, really cool, especially in a book written and published when it was. Feels very ahead of its time. And so they set out, and they're heading south, and they're going to cross over this mountain pass, but the snows, because it's winter now, and the snows, and there's too much danger in this mountain, this Caradhas, and it feels like the mountain itself is sort of has a will of its own and is not allowing them to cross, so they have to go back down the mountain. And then they're trying to debate, do they pass through the gaps of Rohan in the south, which is close to Isengard and Saruman, who they now know is evil, or do they go under the mountain through the mines of Moria, pass through Khazad-dûm, this what had been a traditional dwarven stronghold, but the dwarves delved too greedily and too deep, just sort of now a trope, and awoke something in the darkness, and no one has sort of lived or worked in this place for, I don't know, 100 years or something. There had been a contingent of dwarves 30 years ago that had tried to retake it. Nothing has been sort of heard from them since. But they decide that's their only option. They're going to pass through this dwarven fortress. It seems to be going well until, of course, it's not. A whole bunch of orcs and trolls discover them down there, and they're fleeing from them, and it seems like it's going well until Fire and Shadow, a Balrog of Morgoth, shows up. This ancient evil, Durin's Bane, this horrible creature, smoke and ash and flame, that sort of an evil, it's literally a primeval evil. It's very old and evil, and it's not match of any of them, and they all flee, but they have to pass over the bridge of Khazad-dûm, this sort of single file bridge with no railing or anything, very like health and safety issue. And Gandalf, of course, holds the line and says to this thing, "You cannot pass," and repeats that 3 times, and reveals himself as a servant of the secret flame. And I mean, if you know, you sort of know that he has one of the elven rings, but it's not really outright revealed at this point. But Gandalf destroys the bridge, the Balrog falls, but as it does, its whip grabs Gandalf and pulls him down with it. And so, believing that Gandalf is now dead, the remaining party flee outside, and they don't despair as much as they do in the film. In the film, this is just, of course, again, with the music and sort of the slow motion scene and the weeping, and it's so powerful in the film. Whereas in the book, I feel like they're just like, oh no, Gandalf is gone. What are we going to do? Like, it doesn't have as big of an impact on me as of course the film did. Aragorn then sort of takes the lead as the new leader, and he doesn't really know what Gandalf's plan was, but they continue on. They press into the forest of Loth Lorien, which is a forest where the elves live, and similar to Rivendell, it's kind of a last bastion of the elves and magic, but it's described beautifully in this book, where Rivendell is this place where the memory of the olden days still lives. Loth Lorien is a place where the old days still live, not just the memory of them. And yes, so they pass into there. They meet Galadriel, the lady of the forest. Celebrimbor, her husband, who's the lord of Loth Lorien. He's ostensibly in charge, but really it's all about Galadriel. And I think maybe that's just the films in my head where Galadriel seems such a more important character, but I guess she is in this book as well, with the Mirror of Galadriel, where she shows Frodo and Sam potential futures, and that's where they see the Shire sort of turned into an industrial wasteland. And Frodo sees the eye, and I often hear it said that the idea of the eye, there was no eye on the Tower of Barad-dûr in the books. That's all a creation of the film. But the eye itself is described: the red eye, the flaming eye, the all-seeing eye, the searching eye. It's again and again throughout this book. So maybe it's not physically on top of Barad-dûr, but there still is an eye in the books. They leave the forest by river. They get a series of gifts given to them by Galadriel, including the light of Elendil, their most beloved star, which is, of course, the light of Silmaril, but you don't really know that. Although that's one thing the films do, is they cut out a lot of the sort of backstory and I would say world building that is in the book. Lots of talk of the first stage and especially the second age and Valyrians and the Noldor and the Silmarils and so much stuff that I guess wouldn't really make sense out of context. And I only know because I've read sort of everything Tolkien's written that I'm like, oh, of course, yes, Fëanor and the Silmarils. Yeah, I know all about that. But I guess if you're just reading this for the first time, you'll be like, huh? But it does sort of add a depth to the world. The world has a history. You can sort of tell that Tolkien has, I mean, he's created a whole language and then created a world to fit his language in and then created a story from the world, from the language. And the sort of whole sort of idea of world building, maybe that's what sets Lord of the Rings apart and Tolkien apart, is that previous to him, there wasn't really that sort of thing. I heard it described as sort of a hobby, like how post-war old men in Britain would like have their model train set that they would go and play with in the shed, or they'd have their weird sort of quirky hobbies. And Tolkien's was world building or language creation, and yeah, sort of this really nerdy, weird little hobby that he had that spawned this world that we all now enjoy. Anyways, oh yeah, they were getting gifts from Galadriel. Again, I won't go into it, but they go down the river, leaving Lorien, and that's the final chapter, the breaking of the Fellowship. Boromir becomes tempted by the ring and he tries to take it from Frodo. Frodo flees him, realizing that I can't lead these people or ask these people to come with me to their death, and I can't trust some of these people, so I'm just going to have to go off alone. And so he gets in a boat by himself and starts to flee. But Sam, his servant Sam, realizes what his master's going to do, and so he sort of preempts Frodo and rushes to the boats just as Frodo's leaving and kind of forces Frodo to take him with him, although Frodo is overjoyed that Sam is coming with him. And so that's how it ends, with Frodo and Sam leaving, going to the east side of the river, heading towards Mordor, while the other seven, or I guess the other six members of the Fellowship are now left on the western side, and we'll see what happens to them in the second book. But that's the main plot. There are a lot of songs and poems in the Fellowship of the Ring, and I presume in the other two books as well. It's funny because he has written a lot of poetry and a lot of songs for these novels, but a lot of the times the characters will recite these songs and then say like, oh, that's actually just kind of a rough translation of the original Elvish. It's not very good. So the author is sort of in a meta way, kind of very humble about his writing, which I don't think it's incredible stuff. Like, it's not the sort of poetry that blows me away. I mean, some of it's really, really good, but some of it's just sort of like kind of fun, goofy songs. I mean, of course, better than anything I can do, so who am I to criticize? But I do appreciate that they're in there. It gives sort of a different vibe to the story, that they'll sort of stop and the characters will compose their own songs just on the fly, or there'll be some that, like I said, are translations of these old Elvish tales that, again, sort of hint at the much deeper and rich lore and backstory of this world. Yeah, so that is the Fellowship of the Ring. In terms of films, probably my least favorite, although I know that's blasphemous. I know a lot of people that say it's their very favorite of the films. In terms of books, I don't know. It's like I said, it's been over 2 decades since I read the last two, so I'll make a judgment on that after I've read all 3 of them. It is the longest of the 3, which is interesting. But I am excited and I've already started reading The Two Towers, so that will be our next video. Thank y'all.